When the sun gets up in Rome, the world's day can begin. Hello, I'm James Mason. This is the Sala Regia in the Vatican, a room conceived on an imperial scale in order to impress the ambassadors who came here that they were dealing with a major power, both here and in the hereafter. And they were confronted with magnificence. For the popes, patrons of the arts, as well as vicars of Christ on earth, made a storehouse of the Vatican. And what it holds still in paint and stone and precious metals and even more precious manuscripts and relics and records and silk and bronze and ivory, what it holds still is the record of the Christian experience as it emerged from the underground labyrinths in Rome to the splendor that you see now. Welcome to the Vatican collections. For the first time ever, a selection of art from the Vatican is touring the United States, visiting first New York, then Chicago and San Francisco. The show in the Metropolitan Museum in New York is the most expensive traveling exhibition ever mounted. $8 million donated by private companies for restoration, display costs, promotion, and security. The intrinsic value of the pieces is incalculable. Pope John Paul II said this of the works of art.
They will speak of history, of the human condition in its universal challenge, and of the endeavors of the human spirit to attain the beauty to which it is attracted.
the Appian Way. The Roman legions marched out along it to conquest and returned by it in triumph, bringing captive kings, exotic beasts, and the booty of the world. Outward from the center, along roads like this one, the Romans carried a way of life. They brought their military machinery and the rule of law. They dominated nature with feats of engineering. They brought their pantheon of pagan gods, their piped water, and the idea of decorum. They called it the Pax Romana. We may call it civilization. The Romans' day in the sun changed the face of the earth. First, they used force. Maximum force. They made the armored fighting vehicle a commonplace. They were invincible. And they were visionaries.
Tu reggere, imperio populus Romani momentum.
O Romans, be it your care to rule the nations with imperial sway. These shall be your arts: to impose the rule of peace, to spare the humbled, and to crush the proud. The Romans settled things. They valued fortitude. They were great patrons of art. They were calculating, imaginative, forceful. They loved success. If ancient Rome had a heart, it was here, the Roman Forum. It held stores and temples, meeting houses, monuments to Roman glory, and many works of Roman art. And then, when the Roman sun set, its sculpted marble was burned to make quicklime. Grass and wildflowers took over where Caesar had walked. The Colosseum reminded one observer of a gigantic stone bowl in which Rome collected the blood of the world. Some died here for their convictions. Christian martyrs, thrown to the lions because they would not renounce their religion. But in the end, it was they who prevailed. At first, the Christians had been a secret sect, sometimes even forced to hide in the catacombs among the dead. But as Rome's power ebbed away, Christianity moved into the light. These are Christian signs, perhaps of martyrs. The fish and the Good Shepherd were Christian symbols from the beginning. A Roman style brought to the Christian story of the loaves and fishes. Perhaps the first portrait of St. Peter, apostle, first pope of Rome, and martyr, after whom everything followed. What followed was the Dark Ages, upon which only the Church cast any illumination at all. The centuries slept, and then, after 1,000 years, an awakening, the discovery of texts that brought back knowledge of the ancient world, a renaissance. A renaissance that meant painting and books and music and poetry and architecture and a fever in men's minds. The first true Renaissance pope was Nicholas V, whose private chapel this is. The son of a country doctor, Nicholas was mild of manner, short and ugly, and in poor health brought on by too much study. Above all, he was modest. He called himself a mere bell-ringing priest. The man who decorated the chapel was a friend of Nicholas and equally humble. He was a plain Dominican friar who only wanted his art to preach. We know him as Fra Angelico. Nicholas had two passions other than his religion. He loved building and he adored books. He spent lavishly to stock the Vatican library. And with the books and a love of learning came the Renaissance and a new concentration on human values. It took a while for the changes to take hold, for the old and beautiful simplicities to be absorbed into something that had never been seen before. Then, like a springtime in the mind, the Renaissance brought fresh color and warmth, a new intensity. Painters began to exercise a newfound sophistication of technique with confidence and imagination. The subjects acquired subtler, truer shapes. They applied the laws of perspective to create a microcosm of the real world. Harmonious, calm, and full of grace. The painters of the early Renaissance could expect strong support from such men as this. Pope Sixtus IV, incomparable patron of writers, artists, and architects. Though raised in obscurity, Sixtus IV was a born ruler. It was Sixtus who sponsored the Sistine Chapel, where popes have been elected ever since. The plan of the Sistine Chapel was simplicity itself, and perfectly proportioned. It was the most challenging space in all the world. And Sixtus had it furnished with the work of the finest painters he could command. They brought to life the stories of Christ and the Church. There was another side to Sixtus. Like all princes of his time, he took good care of his own. He had 6 nephews, 3 of them he made cardinals. That was only natural. 1 of them was well worth the trust. He became Julius II, one of the greatest patron popes of all. But the church was more than a political institution. It was a spiritual power that had survived through a millennium. And it was about to enter an age of light, in which a pope would express through art the majesty of the throne of St. Peter. Julius II, master of Raphael and Michelangelo. In a sense, the Renaissance was a quest, a search for harmony, an attempt to reach whatever heights humanity might be capable of. Part of the quest was the acquisition of art, in particular of sculpture. There were other motives behind papal patronage, too. The popes enjoyed the fame it brought. They had a human weakness for beauty. And the art glorified the church. It began on the grand scale with classical sculpture. Antiquity had strength. It brought back the heroes. It brought back the certainties of a great departed age. Jupiter, Zeus, father of the gods. It brought back exquisite, forgotten skills that made marble seem like living flesh. The fountainhead was Greece, though often the style had firmly Roman overtones. The Romans of the Golden Age had copied Greek originals. Greek or Roman, they carried the stamp of ancient times. An Amazon, one of a race of women warriors from the Black Sea. Ariadne, deserted on the island of Naxos, but to become the bride of Bacchus. Bacchus the roisterer, the god of wine and patron of the drama. Old Father Nile, a few centuries ago, reckoned one of the great sculptures of the world, a prize for visitors to seek out. The 16 cherubs represent the 16 cubits by which the Nile flooded every year. Athena, who sprang fully armed from the head of Zeus. Goddess of war, science, and the fine arts. Wisdom, strength, heroic proportions, and heroic aspirations. That is what the sculpture symbolized. And these were attributes that endeared themselves to the new master of Rome and occupant of the throne of St. Peter. Giuliano della Rovere, nephew of Sixtus IV. Pope Julius II. Julius was always in a hurry. He had his architect Bramante build him a special staircase so that he could ride on his horse all the way up to his private apartments. Julius was a formidable man. His will was implacable, his anger terrifying, and his ambition limitless. He could lead troops in battle, and he could overcome the obstinacy of a hard-headed genius like Michelangelo. He was himself a Renaissance man. With one single act, Julius began what was to become one of the world's most remarkable collections of art. He placed a Roman copy of a Greek bronze of the sun god Apollo in a courtyard of his papal palace. The Apollo Belvedere was the standard, the paragon. He was the god of light and of ideal male beauty. He was perfect. The courtyard where Apollo stood was filled with the songs of nightingales. And there were other sculptures. One of which became as famous as the Apollo. Laocoon, a priest of Apollo in Troy, was punished by the gods for having warned the Trojans against the Greeks. He and his 2 sons were crushed to death by 2 sea serpents. Here is expressed with awesome power the agony of humanity in distress. Here is all our lives. Part of Julius's new domain was the Sistine Chapel. He decided to enhance the ceiling. He commissioned a well-known sculptor, Michelangelo Buonarroti, to paint a subject worthy of the church and its pope. What Michelangelo did was to lay bare the relationship between man and God. Protesting and rebellious, complaining that he had small experience with colors, Michelangelo worked virtually alone. He began in the spring of 1508, painting on wet plaster, cramped, bullied by Julius, but indomitable. Four years later, he had painted some 300 figures in 9 scenes from the Old Testament, tracing the spiritual history of mankind. It was perhaps the most heroic concept in all art. Julius despised his predecessor, Alexander Borgia, and would not occupy his apartments. He chose these rooms instead. and they became known not by his name, but by the name of the young man he commissioned to decorate them, Raphael. Raphael was working in this room while Michelangelo was laboring away on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The dispute on the Blessed Sacrament. It is, in fact, a glorification of Catholicism. Raphael's commission required him to deal with two themes in this room: theology and philosophy, the school of Athens. Raphael shows within a space remarkably like the new St. Peter's then under construction, the entire convocation of Greek philosophers in the cool, clear light of Athens. Raphael included himself wearing a black cap. And a thoughtful portrait of his rival, Michelangelo. In an adjoining room, Raphael dealt with a subject dear to the popes: the release of St. Peter from prison. The theme Raphael was asked to illustrate in this room was how divine intervention had at various times saved the threatened church. Here, the thief Heliodorus is expelled from the temple. The guard is making sure that everything is safe. Raphael's work did more than glorify the Vatican's chambers. It illuminated the central doctrines by which the Church survived. Raphael is the transfiguration of Christ. It was Raphael's last work. He was 37. His career had been brief but brilliant beyond words. The blinding force of his vision made this his masterpiece, and a model for painters in the centuries to come. Not much has changed in the Vatican gardens since Julius II walked around here. Julius was a great builder of palaces, a lover of vast, decorated spaces. He undertook tremendous enterprises, and this, St. Peter's, as we know it, was his concept. He laid the foundation stone in 1506. He didn't live until it was finished, because it took 100 years to build. But he must have died knowing that it would be his monument. While the Church was being challenged by Protestantism and redefining its positions, Michelangelo, growing old, was brooding about his own destiny. The Last Judgment had been commissioned by Pope Paul III. It represented 5 years of Michelangelo's working life and the somber power of his mature vision. In 1527, mercenaries from Spain and Germany in the employ of the Pope's enemies, men without discipline or mercy, sacked Rome. They surged through the city for 8 days, torturing, killing, raping, plundering, burning. They took whatever treasure they fancied and they left Rome a smoking shell. And as for Pope Clement VII, they held him captive for ransom. The sack of Rome made the church face reality. Patronage dried up. The artists left. The Reformation and the Counter-Reformation brought death and destruction to all Europe, and a new austerity. The church re-evaluated its possessions. Some it classified as inappropriate and banished them. The church, retrenching, tried to return to its spiritual roots. After nearly a century, the classical influence re-emerged stronger than ever. In this case, in Nicolas Poussin's The Martyrdom of Saint Erasmus. At the same time, a new realism was developing. Its most powerful expression was the paintings of Caravaggio. This one is the deposition of Christ. Its originality lies in its vivid representation of actuality. Christ's mother is an old woman. Nicodemus is an ordinary laborer. Nothing is idealized. Caravaggio heralded the Baroque age, and the chief patron of the age was Maffeo Barberini, Pope Urban VIII. Urban's instrument was a man whose mind was full of storms. Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Single-handed, he created an entire style. The essence of the Baroque was energy. Bernini's touch to convey the divine, the mystical, and the earthly led him to an entirely new mixture of materials, textures, colors. For Bernini, everything was in constant motion, like the vortex of a whirlpool. Rippling metal and marble swirling towards heaven in a paean to the Baroque and the freedom of the soul. The baldachin, covering the papal altar and the tomb of St. Peter. 90 tons of bronze, which was stripped from the Pantheon, one of the oldest buildings in Rome, and some of it from the dome of St. Peter's itself. As many tons again of marble, 10 years of labor. Bernini was the one person who best expressed in his art the upsurge of confidence within the church. His work in St. Peter's left no doubt in the mind. This was a place where faith was strong. Bernini's final achievement was the colonnade that embraced St. Peter's Square as if the church were reaching out to comfort everyone in the world. The genius of the design lies in the fact that the whole vast result seems supremely natural. In the high fashion of the ancient Romans, Bernini placed sentinels atop his colonnade, Christ and a congregation of saints and servants of God. Bernini's marble custodians have witnessed centuries of change. But change has not affected one thing: the spiritual authority they represent to hundreds of millions around the world. The great age of papal acquisitions ended long ago. Ours is the era of conservation, and perhaps of something more. The message of the Vatican collections now ranges far beyond the boundaries of Rome. The years do not deal kindly with beauty. And of all the years of technology and industry, the years of pollution have been the most damaging. It is ironic that in an age that prides itself on making art available to all, art is most rapidly destroyed. For the Vatican, merely keeping up with what is being lost is a major concern, as it is elsewhere. To lose this is to lose our inheritance. The Pope is no longer a patron in the Renaissance style, nor is he a worldly prince. But for all the change, one thing remains unaltered and inviolate. The Pope we see today, direct heir of St. Peter, still carries the spiritual authority of the hundreds of popes who preceded him. The Pope still presides over the artistic treasures assembled by his predecessors. They're displayed in no fewer than 10 separate museums. The range is comprehensive. The taste, eclectic. Value? Unrelated to material worth. Nowadays, the collections are open to everyone, not just a select few. But people come for the same reason. To see what for centuries has been the world's best collection of religious art. What the visitors do not see is the amount of effort that goes into preservation. The aim is never to recreate, only to restore, to keep intact. Modern restoration, above all, respects the purity of the original work. "6,000 colors are kept by the Missionaries of Mary, a French order, to repair the Vatican's tapestries. It's a labor that calls for calm, diligence, and love. The results of this devotion are obvious. On a wall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art hangs some of the evidence. A tapestry, The Miraculous Draught of Fishes, designed by Raphael and newly restored. This selection represents centuries of patronage by an institution that can rightfully claim to be one of the oldest continuing collectors of art in the world. As Pope John Paul II himself has said,
These works of art will speak of God because they speak of man created in the image and likeness of God. And in so many ways, they will turn our attention to God Himself.
Too fragile to be restored. Leonardo da Vinci's St. Jerome. A study of age that forces us to contemplate our own mortality. It was there at the beginning, and it will be there at the end. Michelangelo loved it and learned from it. Placed near the Apollo Belvedere when the Vatican collections began, the Belvedere torso is perhaps the strongest single work of art in the collections. Its message is peculiarly one for our season. Headless, armless, legless, it still pulses with the will to survive. In the Vatican, the ages speak to us in an unbroken continuity, for what is great at the beginning remains so throughout time, and what the popes recognized in distant years as worth preserving still enriches our lives today.
This program was produced by NBC News, which is responsible for its content.